My parents divorced when I started college. By the time I was old enough to understand things, their relationship had already grown cold, and we were living as a family only in appearance. It was what you'd call a shotgun wedding. My father, who was popular with women, married because of my conception. "If it weren't for that, I wouldn't have had to get married," was his constant refrain, and he didn't even try to hide his affairs. As for my mother, she resented being forced by my grandparents to drop out of college and become a housewife because of her pregnancy. She would wail and cry every time my father had an affair, and she wouldn't let me near her. That's how I grew up to be an emotionally distant child. So when my father and mother divorced, I actually felt relieved. I explained that if they gave me 4 years' worth of college tuition and half of my living expenses up front, I would be independent from then on. My father left to be with his new wife and children, while my mother went abroad. I'm now 34, living with my husband and our 3-year-old daughter. My husband was originally my colleague at the same company. Given my troubled past, I didn't expect our relationship to last. However, he tried to treat me as an equal. That's when I think I first understood what it meant to love someone. When he proposed, I was happy, but fear overshadowed my joy. However, my in-laws quickly dispelled my worries. My in-laws consisted of his parents and his sister, who was the same age as me. My father-in-law was actually my husband's stepfather. When I confessed that neither of my parents would likely attend our wedding and that I was estranged from both sides of my family, my mother-in-law cheerfully brushed it off, saying, "Well then, I could walk down the aisle with you." And my mother-in-law added, "The formalities don't matter. What's important to me is whether my son will be happy." So we got married. In our 3rd year of marriage, our daughter was born. During this time, my husband changed jobs and started a business with my sister-in-law's friend. Currently, he's busy every day as the co-president of a travel company. At my in-law's suggestion, I started helping with the accounting at my father-in-law's company. It was a company he had started with his previous wife, who had passed away from illness. My father-in-law, who had no children of his own, threw himself into managing the company as a memento of his late wife. Now the company has grown to own its own building in a prime location. As a family member of the president, I worked diligently without taking advantage of my position. My father-in-law had warned me that getting a company off the ground and onto a stable path would be difficult. So I took care of everything at home, telling my husband, "We're fine, just take care of yourself," to which he would reply, "Sorry, I'll be careful about my health." The company grew rapidly, but from then on, my husband started coming home later and later. We used to visit his parents' house once a month, but those visits almost completely stopped. I wish he would visit even occasionally. This was especially important because we learned that my mother-in-law had developed a serious illness. After my husband and sister-in-law's biological father died in an accident, my mother-in-law raised her children alone while running a restaurant. Then she married my father-in-law. When she became ill, she immediately chose palliative care. My father-in-law tried to convince her not to give up on surgery, but in the end, she said, "Please let me decide how to spend my remaining time," and he had to back down. I told my husband, but he just said it wasn't his or his sister's place to interfere with Mom's decision. I thought he was respecting his mother's wishes, but he became reluctant to visit her while she was receiving care at home. His sister also brushed it off. Every time I visit with my daughter, my mother-in-law glances behind us. It breaks my heart knowing she's checking to see if my husband came, and I can see it pains my father-in-law too. When my daughter innocently says that Daddy hasn't played with her lately, my mother-in-law looks a bit sad and says, "Oh my, what a bad daddy. Well, you'll have to scold him properly next time you see him." It makes me sad too. Late one night, my father-in-law called to say my mother-in-law's condition had suddenly worsened and she'd been rushed to the hospital. I quickly woke up my daughter and sent a message to my husband, but he didn't read it. When we arrived at the hospital by taxi, only my father-in-law was there. I tried calling the company in desperation, but only got the answering machine. Soon after, the doctor informed us that my mother-in-law had passed away. 2 hours after returning home with my mother-in-law's body, my husband and his sister finally rushed in. By then, many employees from my father-in-law's company had already arrived to help and pay their respects, and they all gave cold looks to my husband, who was clearly hungover with bed hair, and his sister in her flashy dress. I didn't feel like speaking to either of them either. When they tried to make excuses, my angry father-in-law coldly cut them off. "Enough. I don't want to raise my voice in front of your mother. Keep your excuses to yourself." Intimidated by the surrounding stares, they huddled in a corner of the room. It seemed my mother-in-law had already arranged her funeral details with a funeral home she trusted, and many people who knew her had been notified of her passing. The funeral was well attended, reflecting how respected she had been. Throughout all this, my husband and his sister just sat there, no longer seeming to care about the disapproving looks around them. 10 days after the funeral, on my day off, I received an express delivery. The sender was a law firm. Inside were a sealed letter and a piece of letterhead paper from the law firm. The paper explained that my mother-in-law had entrusted them with the enclosed letter to be sent to me 10 days after her death. It also included instructions to read this without letting the children know, and an address. Taking the enclosed key, I hurried to the specified address with my daughter. What I found there was beyond anything I could have imagined. My husband, his sister, my daughter, and I were called to my father-in-law's house. After we settled on the living room sofa, my father-in-law made a phone call, and shortly after, 2 men in suits entered following a knock. My husband and his sister looked puzzled at first but brightened up when the men presented their law firm business cards. The 2 lawyers turned to face all of us and announced, "We will now read the deceased's last will and testament. Before we begin, we should note that this is a legally binding will. According to the will, my mother-in-law's assets included a building she had purchased and built, the rights to manage the restaurant, and various savings accounts. Of these, the savings would go to my father-in-law, while the building, restaurant management rights, and a $100,000 life insurance policy would go to my husband and his sister. The savings amounted to about $200,000, but the building's real estate value far exceeded that. Normally, inheritance rights would give half to my father-in-law and the other half split between my husband and his sister, so they kept glancing at my father-in-law, but when he said, "I have no objections to this," they looked relieved and signed the inheritance division agreement. When the discussion turned to dividing up my mother-in-law's personal belongings, my sister-in-law, elated about getting the building, said, "What, Mom's personal things? You mean those antiques?" I don't want those old-fashioned things that can barely be called antiques. So I asked, may I have them then? I'd like to keep them as mementos of mother-in-law and pass them down to my daughter. They readily agreed. Furthermore, since lawyers were present, I had them draw up a consent form acknowledging the transfer of personal belongings to me, an outsider, and got all 3 family members to sign it. My husband and sister-in-law laughed at how formal it seemed, but as they were about to leave, I stopped them and presented divorce papers to my husband. He was shocked to be served with divorce papers from me, especially in this setting. I hired a private investigator and have evidence of your ongoing affair with your sister's friend, your business partner. My demands are sole custody of our daughter, compensation, and child support paid in full upfront. I don't need any division of assets. When I presented the calculation of compensation and child support amounts along with the divorce agreement that I had prepared with my lawyer, he suddenly started laughing, saying, well, if you knew all along, we didn't need to put on this act. His sister joined in, right? And I had such a hard time covering for my brother's affair. They both kept laughing hysterically. Ignoring them, the lawyer urged them to sign, which they did triumphantly, promising to transfer the money the next day. I informed them that I had already moved all important belongings from our apartment to another location, and they could dispose of whatever was left when they cleared out the room. When I asked, I have sole custody, but what about visitation rights with our daughter? My husband carelessly replied, since there's no need to hide it anymore, I'll tell you, I'm having another child over there soon. So it's better if we say goodbye to our daughter now, with a smirk. I was about to explode with anger, but my father-in-law calmly suggested, then we should add that to the agreement and have him sign it, which I did. My husband and his sister stood up. Well, goodbye. Be good and listen to your mama, he said, waving without looking back as they left the house. As I held my confused daughter tightly, my father-in-law gently patted my head. After confirming that the promised compensation and child support had been deposited, I submitted the divorce papers. When I was about to rent an apartment for my daughter and me, my father-in-law said, though we have no legal ties anymore, would you like to live here together if you're comfortable with it? You won't have to pay rent here. It's true that living here would minimize the stress and environmental changes for my daughter. Though I hesitated to accept such generosity, we agreed that I would take care of the housework in lieu of rent. My daughter is delighted to live with her beloved grandpa, and my father-in-law smiles, saying, I'm sure my wife is happy somewhere, hearing our grandchild's laughter in this house. Indeed, I sometimes feel my mother-in-law's presence watching over us. Meanwhile, my ex-husband and former sister-in-law quickly sold the restaurant management rights to the respective store managers and were eagerly awaiting the building's title transfer. However, when they started the transfer process, they discovered that the building had a revolving mortgage, which my late mother-in-law had used to secure funds for business expansion. Furthermore, the current creditor wasn't the original bank but a suspicious finance company. My mother-in-law had stopped making payments about 6 months before her death, and if they wanted to sell the building as planned, they would need to negotiate with the finance company about how and when to repay the remaining debt, following complex procedures. Moreover, the travel company that had seemed successful was actually running at a loss due to the loose financial management of my ex-husband and other executives, so they couldn't arrange the necessary funds. Then, as various troublemakers, fraudsters, and pseudo-developers who prey on potentially valuable real estate and finance companies swarmed in. My ex-husband and his sister lost their rights to the building, and their travel company went bankrupt. Abandoned by his mistress, the $100,000 from mother-in-law's life insurance was immediately used to repay loans for the lump sum divorce settlement and child support payments, leaving them both with zero assets. No, actually negative, since they still had debts. When no one would help them anymore, the two came to our house, hoping to appeal to me and my father-in-law. However, my father-in-law told them, "I never legally adopted you, and our relationship ended when my wife died. This has nothing to do with me. Don't ever come back." I also said, "We're divorced, so you're a complete stranger to me. You're only my daughter's father, and since you gave up visitation rights, I have no business with you." Their faces fell in despair. Still, my former sister-in-law persisted, saying, "Then give back Mom's belongings that we let you have. We could at least get some money for those." So I brought them out and told them to take whatever they wanted. They both changed their expressions and started grabbing things. When I showed them mother-in-law's stamp album, they said, "We don't want such childish things," and left with their arms full of her other belongings. In fact, the most valuable items among mother-in-law's possessions were the stamps in that album. Following the note in the album, I went to a storage unit. Using the key I had, I opened the room to find a small cash box containing evidence of my ex-husband's affair from the investigation company, one stamp, and a long letter. It seems my mother-in-law had sensed that my ex-husband and former sister-in-law's business was fragile, partly due to his affair. When she learned she didn't have long to live, her first concern was for the future of my daughter and me, who had nowhere else to turn. Besides, I simply cannot forgive the betrayal of the children I raised with such difficulty. My late husband, their father, repeatedly had affairs, and I cried countless times because of it. My children knew this well, yet they're doing the same thing their father did. My mother-in-law wrote that after her death, she wanted to ensure the inheritance would smoothly pass to my daughter and me while getting revenge on her children by setting up a mortgage with a notoriously predatory finance company. She used that money to win an auction for a rare stamp that collectors worldwide coveted. She then deliberately stopped paying back the loan that used the building as collateral. I considered putting this stamp in a bank safety deposit box, but it might be frozen immediately after my death, and the children might find it then. I hope you're reading this letter, that you have this stamp in your possession, and that you and my granddaughter will live happily. After reading the letter's conclusion, I couldn't stop crying. When I showed the letter to my father-in-law, it turned out my mother-in-law had arranged for him to receive a similar letter. Knowing everything, my father-in-law decided to participate in the plan for his wife's sake, and we carried out everything exactly as she had envisioned. As I greet mother-in-law's photo with my daughter, I speak in my heart, "Mother-in-law, you will forever be my irreplaceable mother-in-law. Come on, hurry up, or you'll be late," says my father-in-law, his eyes also moistening. I turn back to mother-in-law's photo one more time and call out loudly, "We're heading out."